The battlefield was supposed to be silent after victory, but silence never felt so heavy. Smoke curled upward like dark fingers, reaching for a sky that had already seen too much fire. Scorched metal hissed in the cold air. Broken machines sparked faintly, struggling to live even when the war around them was done. And among the ruins, Commander lay flat on the shattered ground, staring at a world that felt painfully distant. He was alive. He knew that. But he did not feel alive. Pain pulsed through his limbs, but it was not the kind that came from wounds. His armor was cracked and dust filled the gaps, but his flesh was mostly untouched. It was his spirit, heavy, exhausted, shaking under an invisible weight that refused to rise. He heard footsteps crunching through debris, light, quick, human. Only one person walked like that on a field like this. Myra. She slid into view beside him, the faint glow from her medical visor reflecting in her warm brown eyes. He remembered those eyes from so many battles, calm, steady, the kind that could convince even a dying soldier to take one more breath. Her hair was tucked safely under her helmet, but a small strand had escaped and brushed her cheek like a quiet reminder of gentleness in a cruel world. She knelt beside him without a word. Humans always moved like that, soft steps, but heavy presence. He never understood how a species so physically small could carry so much emotional weight. She touched his shoulder, her gloved hand warm even through layers of armor. "Commander," she said, voice low and controlled. "Can you hear me?" He nodded, though the movement felt slow, almost sluggish. She leaned closer, close enough that he could feel her breath warming the cold air trapped inside his helmet. Her closeness was not uncomfortable. It was grounding, like gravity had returned to his drifting mind. Her voice softened even more. "Tell me, do you need me now?" she asked, "or later?" Had faced nightmares that could tear through steel. He had watched stars die and heard whole cities cry out for help that never came. But no threat, no monster, no enemy had ever undone him the way that simple question did. Because Myra did not mean physical help. She already knew his body was mostly fine. It was his silence that told her the real wound was somewhere deeper. He tried to speak, the words stuck. Myra waited. Humans were strange like that. They weren't the most advanced species, not the strongest, not the fastest. But they had a patience that could break the hardest stone. She didn't rush him. She didn't push him. She simply stayed right there, close enough to feel, but far enough to breathe. Swallowed hard. The battlefield around them faded as if the smoke itself bent away from her presence. I do not know," he finally whispered. Her eyes didn't change. She didn't flinch or frown. She only nodded gently, her expression softening in a way that made his chest ache. "That's all right," she murmured, her voice warm like a small fire in a cold cave. "You don't have to decide yet." Her hand squeezed his shoulder, not as a medic, but as a person choosing to stay. "I'm here," she said, "whether you need me now or later." His vision blurred, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the thin crack in the wall around him widen, not enough to break, but enough to breathe. Around them, distant cries from other wounded soldiers echoed through the ruins, but Myra didn't move. She didn't rush to the next person. For that moment, she stayed with him, as if his silent, invisible wounds mattered just as much as any bleeding injury. He wondered how a species that had only joined the galactic community recently could understand things even ancient civilizations struggled with. He wondered how Myra, a human medic, could see through armor that even plasma could not break. And he wondered why that simple question, asked gently, asked with real care, felt more terrifying than any enemy he had ever faced. He tried again to speak, but his voice cracked. This time she placed a hand over his, steady and warm. "You're safe now," she whispered. And somehow he believed her. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting her presence anchor him. Myra wasn't just a medic. She was something far rarer on the battlefield. A reminder that even in the darkest ruins, humans could bring light simply by caring. The sky above the battlefield was painted with the cold light of dying stars. Smoke hung like heavy curtains, and the smell of scorched metal and burned flesh clung to the air. rose slowly, leaning on his fractured armor. Every movement reminded him that the war had not only the world, it had carved deep scars into him. He had survived. Somehow he had survived. And yet surviving felt almost worse than dying. There was no glory here, only ruin. Ships that once shone like silver ghosts lay broken, their hulls twisted and melted. Towers that had touched the clouds were reduced to piles of rubble. And scattered among the wreckage were bodies of soldiers from dozens of worlds, some alien, some human, all lost to the same unrelenting storm of fire. These people, were proud warriors. They were bred to endure, to fight, to conquer. Their cities had been built to last centuries, their ships able to withstand orbital bombardment. Yet against all that pride and strength had been tested to the breaking point. They were not like any enemy had faced before. They were vast, relentless, cruel. They didn't merely invade, they consumed. Whole moons became weapons. Populations were turned into fuel. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat, and their numbers seemed endless. And yet humanity had arrived. Still did not understand them. Humans were small, fragile, soft-skinned creatures, not built to survive harsh planets or cosmic radiation. They had no natural armor, no scales, no wings, no claws. And yet here they were, running into fire, carrying the wounded, and refusing to leave anyone behind. Myra was one of them. She had arrived with her team days ago, just after they had struck the first orbital station. They were not soldiers. They were medics, engineers, disaster specialists. Their ships were slower, their armor lighter, their weapons barely enough to defend themselves. And yet they moved like a storm across the battlefield. Where they might have retreated to regroup, humans ran toward danger. Where they hesitated at the screams of the dying, humans moved with steady hands and open hearts. Had watched them rescue soldiers trapped under collapsed walls. He had seen them shield children from fire with nothing but courage and human flesh. He had seen Myra carry a wounded warrior, whispering stories of oceans and green forests until the soldier's eyes closed one last time. He had seen her stand alone while plasma bolts streaked around her, refusing to leave anyone behind. And still she had come to him. He looked at Myra now, kneeling beside him amidst the ruins, and he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not the blind, foolish hope of soldiers clinging to survival, but a quiet, stubborn hope that burned stronger than any weapon. He could not explain it. Humans were not the strongest, they were not the fastest, they were not the most advanced. They should not have survived this war, and yet they did. They survived because they refused to give up on each other. They survived because they cared. And in a universe where strength was measured by destruction, that kind of care became a weapon more terrifying than any plasma cannon. They had laughed when the Terran medics arrived. They had mocked their small ships and frail bodies. They had expected humans to fall like every other species. But they did not understand that humans carried more than armor and bullets. They carried courage, determination, and the kind of love that refused to leave anyone behind. Still remembered the first time he saw it in action. A human soldier had thrown herself in front of a collapsing bridge to save a child. Her body had been burned, but she had survived. The child had survived, and in that moment had realized that humanity was not just a species, it was a force. And now Myra was here, kneeling beside him, asking if he needed her. Not because it was her duty, not because protocol demanded it, but because she had chosen to care. That choice was stronger than any shield. Let himself breathe, even if only for a moment. He allowed the weight of the war, the fear, the loss, and the exhaustion to press down on him. And he allowed Myra's presence to remind him that survival was more than enduring. It was living, even in the shadow of annihilation. Somehow, against all odds, humans had arrived. Against all odds, they were here. And somehow in their quiet, unshakable way, they had changed the meaning of survival. Did not yet know how, he did not yet know the full cost of their courage, but he knew one thing: humanity would not leave him behind. And in that, for the first time in a long, long while, he felt he might live again, could not stop thinking about Myra's question. It was simple, almost too simple. Do you need me now or later? Yet it struck him deeper than any weapon, any blast, any enemy he had faced. It was not a question about wounds or armor. It was a question about something far more dangerous, the truth of his heart. On battlefields, soldiers learned to hide pain. Wounds were measured in bleeding or broken bones, not in fear or loneliness. A commander was supposed to endure. A warrior was supposed to ignore exhaustion, and had followed those rules his entire life, until now. Myra's voice, soft and unhurried, had cut through the armor he wore around his emotions. She had asked not because she wanted to know, but because she could feel. Humans had a way of sensing what others could not, what he could not even admit to himself. She had seen past the stoicism, past the pride, past the fear. She had seen the part of him that was empty, tired, and afraid. He tried to remember the last time someone asked him if he truly needed them, not as a comrade, not as a soldier, but as a person. The memory was distant and cold. No one had ever stayed long enough to hear the answer. No one had ever offered their presence without expectation. And now Myra had. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, yet the weight of it was immense. It was an anchor in a sea of chaos. Around them, the battlefield still smoldered. Smoke rose from twisted metal, and distant explosions shook the ground. Screams of the wounded carried on the wind, but she did not flinch. She did not hesitate. She stayed. Realized why her question terrified him. Because to answer it honestly meant admitting vulnerability. To answer it meant letting someone see the part of him that had been broken for so long. And he did not know if he could survive that kind of truth. Humans were strange creatures. They were weak in body compared to many species, yet their hearts carried strength no armor could match. They could be gentle and fierce at the same time. They could risk everything for someone else and smile while doing it. He had watched it countless times, yet the understanding still shocked him. Their courage was not about survival alone. It was about choice. Myra's choice had been simple: stay. She had not questioned the danger. She had not argued that he should be left to others. She had chosen to stay. And in that choice she had offered him more than healing or comfort. She had offered connection. Had fought countless battles, but none had demanded honesty like this. To speak would be to admit fear, to admit loneliness, to admit that the walls he had built around his heart for decades were crumbling. Yet the longer he stayed silent, the more unbearable it became. Her presence was patient but insistent, like a quiet hand nudging a locked door until it opened. He tried to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his mind heavy. Myra's eyes softened, and for a moment he thought she might understand without a single word. She did not press. She simply waited, leaning close, letting the world fall away until it was just the two of them. Felt the weight of every battle, every loss, every life he had failed to save. They were all inside him now, pressing against his chest. And yet somehow her calm presence made the weight bearable. She had become more than a medic. She had become proof that even in the darkest place, someone could see your pain and refuse to leave you alone. The battlefield could destroy cities, fleets, even planets. But it could not touch this. Not her determination, not her care, not the warmth of her hand on his shoulder. Closed his eyes for a moment, letting the fear, the grief, and the exhaustion wash over him. He realized that it was not just the war that terrified him anymore. It was the possibility of answering her question, because if he answered honestly, he could not turn back. He could not hide. He could not retreat behind the walls of pride he had built. And yet he knew he wanted to. Myra was waiting, not for his answer, not for him to be ready, but simply for him to exist in the moment with her. She was offering him a chance to let someone in, a chance to be human again. And in the strange, terrifying way humans had, she made him feel that vulnerability could be strength. Swallowed, feeling his chest tighten. The war had taught him to fight, to survive, to endure. But Myra was teaching him something else. Sometimes, surviving meant letting someone stay, letting someone care, and letting yourself need them. And that terrified him more than any fleet ever could, had watched Myra work before. He had seen her move through chaos with a calmness that seemed almost impossible. She never rushed. She never panicked. She simply knelt, touched, whispered, and healed. He had seen her lift soldiers from debris, cradle them gently, and speak to them as if their lives were more precious than the stars themselves. He had never understood why she did it. Humans were fragile. They could not withstand what most considered simple hardships. They had no natural armor, no protective scales, no endurance born of centuries of war. Yet they ran toward danger. They healed even when the cost was their own safety. He had seen her save a soldier once, a young one barely older than a child. Plasma fire had torn through the wall near them. The soldier's armor was shredded and his body shook with pain. Myra had been there in an instant. She had crouched beside him, whispered stories of Earth's oceans, held his hand and guided him through the pain. By the time the battle cleared, he had survived. She had survived, and had watched, unable to intervene, feeling both awe and a strange kind of fear. It was not her skill that struck him, it was her choice. She had chosen to care. And now, kneeling beside him in the aftermath of another battle, she had asked the same question again. Do you need me now or later? Could not answer, not because he didn't know what he needed, but because the truth scared him. He had spent decades learning to hide, to endure, to lead without showing weakness. He had mastered the art of control. To admit that he needed someone, truly needed someone, was to give up the control he had clung to like a shield. His body was strong, his armor was battered but intact. His training had kept him alive, and yet none of that mattered here, because the wound he carried was inside him. It was not blood or metal or bone. It was something older, heavier, and far more dangerous: loneliness, fear, exhaustion of the spirit. And Myra had seen it. Swallowed hard, he tried to find words, but his tongue felt heavy. His pride and his fear clashed inside him. To speak would be to let someone in. To speak would be to admit that he could not survive alone. To speak would be to let himself be human again. He had not done that in years. Yet Myra waited. She did not demand an answer. She did not rush him. She simply stayed. Her hand rested on his shoulder, a quiet promise that he was not alone. Her eyes, warm and steady, reminded him that someone could see the truth without judging it. He thought of all the battles he had survived. He thought of all the soldiers he had led, the worlds he had defended, the sacrifices he had made. And he realized that none of it mattered as much as this moment. Not the victories, not the medals, not even his life. What mattered was connection. He wanted to say it, to tell her that he needed her. He wanted to tell her that her presence had kept him alive in ways he could not explain. He wanted to admit that he feared losing her, even as he feared letting her see the depths of his weakness. And yet the words would not come. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment. He let the heat of the battle fade, the cries of the wounded drift away, the smoke rise and curl into the sky. He let himself feel the simple, terrifying reality that he could not carry everything alone, that he had not carried everything alone. Myra did not flinch. She did not step back. She simply waited, a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. And slowly understood. It was not about bravery. It was not about strength. It was not about surviving another battle. It was about the choice to care. Myra had chosen to care. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to ask. And somehow that choice was more powerful than any weapon, more important than any strategy, more alive than any victory. Opened his eyes, he still could not speak the words, but he did not need to. Myra understood. She always understood. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the walls he had built around his heart might crack. Not enough to shatter, but enough to let light in. Enough to let hope in. Enough to let himself need someone. And for now, that was enough. The battlefield was not quiet for long. Even after the explosions slowed and the smoke began to drift into the dark sky, the echoes of war lingered in every corner. Broken hulls rattled in the wind. Fires flickered on ruined towers. And somewhere beneath the wreckage, someone still screamed. Felt the weight of it all pressing on him. He had survived countless battles, led hundreds of soldiers, and seen friends die in every imaginable way. He had been trained to endure, to move forward, to mask fear with resolve. But this felt different. This was not a fight against an enemy he could see. This was a fight against himself, against the emptiness that had grown inside him over the years. Myra knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, steady and warm. He could feel the faint pulse of life through her touch, simple but unshakable. He tried to speak. Words wanted to come, but they tangled in his throat. His chest felt tight, almost like it would break from the weight of unspoken emotions. "Now or later?" she asked again, softly, leaning close so that her breath brushed his armor. Shook his head, his pride, his fear, his exhaustion, they all whispered that he could not answer, that he could not let someone in, that he had to endure alone. But deep inside, a voice he had ignored for years screamed the truth. He did need her. He needed her now. He needed her before another day of war could crush him completely. His hands shook, his eyes blurred. The battlefield around them, once filled with chaos, now seemed distant, muted. It was just him and her, and the unspoken truth hanging between them like a fragile thread. He began, but his voice faltered. Myra's eyes softened. She did not push. She did not demand. She only leaned closer, letting him feel that he did not have to speak to be understood. Humans had a strange power. They could see the heart without words, feel pain without confession, and offer hope without promise. Realized he had never felt this kind of vulnerability. He had fought to survive against enemies that wanted to erase his entire species. He had stared at death and laughed it off. He had followed orders, led troops, and made choices that should have haunted him. But none of that had ever made him feel so exposed, so alive, so terrified. He wanted to hide, to turn away, to mask the raw, aching truth inside. Yet another part of him, the part that had survived because humans like Myra existed, wanted to reach for her, to hold on, to let her in. Around them, the wind carried the faint smell of burning metal. The cries of the wounded echoed faintly, but Myra did not flinch. She stayed. She waited. And that simple choice, humanity's quiet insistence to stay, to care, to be present, became the strongest force on the battlefield. Finally swallowed the lump in his throat. The armor he had built around himself, the walls of pride and solitude, felt like they were cracking. Not breaking completely, but bending, yielding to a strength far greater than any weapon he had ever commanded. I need you, he whispered, the words small but powerful. Myra's hand tightened on his shoulder, not in force, but in acknowledgement. A small, gentle smile formed beneath her visor. I'm here, she said. Now, always. For the first time in years, allowed himself to release the weight he had carried alone. He let the fear, the grief, the exhaustion, and the pain flow out of him, knowing someone would catch it, hold it, and not judge him for it. The battlefield could destroy ships. It could destroy cities. It could destroy lives. But it could not touch this moment, not her determination, not her presence, not the unshakable choice of a human to stand beside him even when everything else had fallen apart. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with an unfamiliar warmth. He felt for the first time that he could endure anything, because he was not alone. Myra stayed. She had chosen him. She had chosen now. And in that choice, understood something he had never truly believed. Strength was not just in survival. It was in connection. It was in letting someone stand with you when the world wanted to tear you apart. He looked at her, eyes raw but steady. The breaking point he had feared for years was not a moment of collapse. It was a moment of trust, of allowing care to pierce the armor he had worn for too long. And in that trust, he found life again. They had underestimated humans. That was the mistake every enemy had made since the first Terran ship had dared to leave Earth's orbit. Watched from the bridge of a battered cruiser as human ships streaked across the skies like sparks of defiance. They were smaller, slower, and lightly armored compared to the warships, yet they moved with a precision and fearlessness that no machine could replicate. They did not hesitate. They did not falter. And when humans struck back, not for conquest, not for glory, but for something far more powerful, to protect, to save, to care. He remembered Myra in the chaos of the last assault. While soldiers hesitated, calculating, weighing risk, she had sprinted across a collapsing bridge to carry a wounded child from the burning rubble. Her armor scorched, her body trembling from exhaustion, she had smiled at the child and whispered something soft and untranslatable. The child had survived. Myra had survived, and in that moment she had shown the true strength of humanity. Humans were not physically formidable. Their weapons and armor could not match but their determination, their care, their refusal to leave anyone behind, those things were unstoppable. Could see it in the battle now. Terran medics moved through fire and debris, dragging wounded and human soldiers alike to safety. Engineers rebuilt shields in the middle of orbital bombardments. Volunteers, armed only with courage and whatever tools they could carry, ran headlong into danger to evacuate civilians. The head laughed at them, called them weak, called them fragile. But now, the laughter died in the vacuum of space. One human ship rammed into a drone, detonating its engines to protect a cluster of transports. Another deployed a makeshift energy shield that allowed dozens of wounded soldiers to escape unharmed. Humans were everywhere, unpredictable, relentless, and utterly unafraid. Realized something he had never admitted before. The humans were terrifying, not because of their technology, which was inferior, but because of their spirit. They fought in ways that no one could anticipate because their strength came not from machines, but from choice, from love, from the refusal to abandon those who could not defend themselves. He watched Myra again, moving with quiet grace through the chaos. She stopped to aid a young soldier, lifting him effortlessly and giving him water from her pack. She adjusted his armor, soothed his panic, and whispered encouragements no one else would have thought to offer. Wanted to protect her, to shield her from the dangers she faced, but he knew better. Myra did not need protection. She was a storm contained in a human body, small, fragile, but unstoppable because of what she carried inside: courage, compassion, and an unbreakable will to save others. As the battle raged, felt something shift within him. Humans had shown him that victory was not only about weapons or strategy. It was about heart, about persistence, about refusing to surrender even when everything seemed lost. They were strong, yes, but humans were stronger in ways the galaxy had never expected. And through it all, Myra remained by his side. Even in the midst of chaos, even when danger surrounded them, she had chosen to stay. She had asked him days ago if he needed her now or later. And now, in the fury of battle, the answer was clear. He needed her now, and she was here. Allowed himself to feel hope again. Not the fragile hope of someone who dreams while hiding from danger, but the fierce, blazing hope of someone who had seen humanity at its best. They were small, they were fragile, they should not have survived this war, but they had. And in surviving, they had changed the course of the battle. They had changed the fate of worlds. They did not understand it yet. They had underestimated the human heart. And they would pay for it. Looked at Myra, her hands steady as she treated the wounded, her eyes bright with determination. He felt a surge of gratitude, awe, and something he had long forgotten: trust. She had chosen to stay, to care, to fight alongside him when everything seemed lost. And in that choice, humanity's fury became more than a weapon. It became a promise that no darkness, no enemy, no force in the galaxy could break. For the first time, realized what true strength looked like. Not in weapons, not in fleets, not in armors, but in the courage to care, in the determination to stand for others, in the refusal to leave anyone behind. And in that moment, humanity became unstoppable. The sky had cleared. The fires of battle had dimmed, leaving only the cold silver of distant stars above. Stood amidst the ruins, chest heavy but steady, and watched the survivors move through the wreckage. Broken ships were being repaired. Wounded soldiers were being carried to safety. The battlefield that had seemed endless and hopeless only hours ago now felt quiet, almost alive with the fragile pulse of survival. Myra knelt nearby, adjusting bandages on a young recruit, her hands steady and gentle. Her helmet reflected the starlight, but her eyes shone brighter, alive, determined, unwavering. Approached her slowly, feeling an unfamiliar nervousness settle in his chest. He had faced fleets, fought wars, stared death in the face, but now his own words were the hardest enemy. "You once asked," he said quietly, "if I needed you now or later." Myra looked up at him, her expression soft but attentive. "I remember," she said simply. He swallowed hard. Memories of the battlefield, the chaos, the smoke, the screams flooded his mind. But above it all, one truth had become clear. He had survived not because of weapons, not because of strategy, not even because of luck. He had survived because humans like Myra had chosen to stay, to care, to fight even when the odds were impossible. "My answer," he continued, voice trembling slightly, "is both." Myra's hand reached for his, warm and steady, bridging the space between them. Her touch was a quiet promise, a lifeline, a declaration. "Then I'm here," she said softly. "Now and later, always." His eyes burned not with pain, but with a raw, overwhelming emotion he had long buried. Gratitude, relief, trust. He realized fully that humanity's greatest power was not in their weapons, their ships, or even their numbers. It was in their hearts. the way they refused to leave anyone behind, the way they fought for life, for hope, for each other. That courage had changed the outcome of the war, had saved countless lives, and had saved him. He knelt beside her, the weight of his armor now feeling less like a burden and more like a shield he could finally set down. Around them, the world was broken, but it was alive. Survivors were rebuilding. Human and alike worked together, their determination steady as the stars. "You were right," said, his voice low. "It's not just strength in arms, it's in this." He gestured to her hand, holding his, to the quiet connection between them. "It's in caring, in refusing to let anyone be alone." Myra smiled, a small, luminous smile that seemed to hold the warmth of an entire planet. "That's what humans do," she said. "It's why we survive, and it's why we keep going even when the impossible comes for us." His chest tightened. He remembered every human who had risked their life for him, for his soldiers, for strangers they might never see again. He remembered the small, ordinary courage of volunteers, medics, and soldiers alike. And now he understood. The galaxy had never faced a threat like humanity, not because they were strong in the usual ways, but because they were unstoppable when they chose to care. For the first time in years, felt his heart unclench. He could let himself be human again. He could accept help, accept care, and accept trust. Myra's hand in his was not just a lifeline, it was proof that no one had to survive alone. He looked out at the stars, silver and distant, and felt a quiet certainty settle in him. Humanity would continue. They would continue to fight, to save, to stand even when everything seemed lost. And wherever they went, they carried that truth with them. Strength was not in conquering, but in holding together, in lifting each other when the universe tried to tear you apart. Turned back to Myra. I'm glad you stayed," he said, voice trembling with honesty he had never allowed himself to feel. "I never left," she said simply. "I will never leave." And in that moment, the war, the fear, the loss, and the chaos of the battlefield melted away. All that remained was life, hope, and the quiet, unstoppable force of humanity. For the truth was clear. Humanity's power was not just survival. It was the courage to care, the choice to stay, the refusal to abandon those in need, and now he would carry that truth with him forever. He leaned closer and Myra smiled. The battlefield could wait. For the first time, Commander felt that he could face anything. Not because he was invincible, not because he was unbroken, but because he was not alone. And humanity had shown him the way.